Just before we
Michael, can I add a question on that though? It's okay to say that the regulations are new, but the hazard's been around for decades. So, you know, I think one of the things that we're looking at is, to take up Ken's point, is that we can look at regulations, we can look at compliance, or we can look at safety. Now, there's sure the anchor points and the falls, new equipment, new harnesses, all of those sorts of things come in as they evolve. But we've still got the principal hazard of gravity. It's been around for a long time, and that's what we're trying to avoid while we're working at the height. So I respect the issues of regulations. You know, I'm from Victoria, so we don't have regulations that are sexy like yours. But I still think we need to start looking at the hazard, we start looking at the safety, we start looking at the practices, whether it comes from an Australian standard, a regulation, a code of practice, or an industry-based standard, or some industry guidance notes. You know, I'm not overly concerned with where it comes from, but I really think we need to start focusing on the actual hazard that we have to deal with, and that's, you know, it's gravity, it's at heights, and it's that people are falling.
Now, I'm still recovering from the description of regulations as sexy. Look, if it works in the political environment, why can't it work here? But I will nevertheless turn to you again and ask the question. Well, we've seen this sort of systemic failure in other areas before. Now, what can we do about it?
Well, I think that well, one of the things that came up with when we're looking at systemic problems is, of course, every employer or PCBU's got to have a safe system of work. So are we looking at that system? We should be looking at that system because that's the system that we own as PCBU. So yes, we have a very important obligation there on that system. But that system is affected by all the other systems that are out there too. Well, I think we've already heard, you know, clients will be satisfied if you have an anchor point. Whether the anchor point's made of plasticine, it doesn't really matter. They're happy with there's an anchor point in it. So there's a lot of systems involved with this one issue of controlling the hazard. I think there are major problems with client expectations where they tick the box. You got an anchor point, great. Compliance plate on it, great. Move on. We've all seen, you know, dubious anchor points that have still got compliance plates on it. That's just absurd. I think also that we've got a system where the Australian standards, we've heard that they're industry-based. Some people say that they're biased because of the manufacturers are on it, but it is, and also they're not. You don't have to. They're not obligatory. It's good to comply with them, but they're not obligatory in lots of circumstances. So what we've got is the protection of people falling from heights on a house of cards. Now, there might be some, you know, little bits of blue tack on those cards holding them together, but it's still a fairly fragile system that we've got that all comes down, I think, to a single point of that if it's an anchor point, it's got to work. If it's a ladder, it's got to be hard to fall off. If we're working on an EWP, it's got to be regularly maintained. So it all comes down to that point of what Ken said in terms of, is it safe? I'd go down even further. Is it safe for the worker, who is the ultimate person who's going to carry the can for all of the systemic failures? And I think we need to keep that focus on what that person comes into work today. They've got an anchor point, yeah, clip onto that. It's only ever been used once, but it's that once where it fails, pulls out, they're over the edge and gone. So there's some assumptions that workers make, there's some assumptions that PCBUs make, there's many assumptions that regulators and clients make, and I think we have to get through those assumptions because it's the assumptions that are going to kill someone.
Well, just take a blank sheet of paper and say that we haven't had to suffer the last 4 years of harmonisation, whatever that was, and are in a position where we are trying to solve this problem fresh. We're not saddled by the existing standards, we're not saddled by any of the existing structure. What does that solution look like? And I'll open that question to the panel. What are the alternatives? How do we fix this problem?
I'll jump in first because I'm on a roll. I think we have to look at anchor points and other things as not points that relate to access or safe access. What it is it's an emergency point. Somebody said to me this morning, you know, would you be happy if your fire extinguisher, only half of your fire extinguishers worked? Would you be happy if half your sprinklers worked? You know, we're tolerating a failure rate that there seems to be the WAHA data has indicated. We're tolerating a failure rate on items that save lives. And I think that that's a major problem. So we need to start thinking of some of these things as not working at heights or not access points, but as life-saving points. And if we do, I think then some of these issues will get the prominence that they deserve. So I think
does that look like a risk-based approach?
Well, I never like risk-based approach because quite often they'll look at things of we'll minimise the risk instead of increasing safety. And then risk comes down to costs and the risk of exposure and the risk of not going on holidays. What we have to do is have a look at, you know, at the risk of somebody falling, so the hazard of the fall, the hazard of going off the edge. So I think that's what we need to do.
First, Ken? Yeah, quite frankly, I think we've got to rip the guts out of the system and start from scratch, like they did with the fire regulations in the 70s and 80s. I seriously think we've got to review the standards, we've got to have some sort of licensing, we've got to have mandatory training, because we need to trust contractors that put these things in. We can't be across all the standards all the time. We need to include it in the PCA requirements for every OC, and we also need to have a look at the BCA. There's nothing in the BCA about any of this. Not at all.
To the audience, the acronym BCA, Building Control?
Building Code of Australia.
Building Code of Australia, yeah. There's nothing in it about any of the installations or the anchor points or anything. So, you know, where do you start? Well, you've got to insert that.
I'll go to
reference point for the design you were mentioning before, in terms of importance to the design. If it's not there in the BCA, what's the reference document that the designers have got?
I'll go to Peter before I'll let the other panel members sort of comment. I'll have to regulate this panel. Very rowdy. I'll go Peter, Carl, then Mike, and then come back to Dimitri.
I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I think once again we've got to question the end point, and that is the user. We're constantly allowing people with no knowledge, no proper overview to put a harness on and believe they're going to be safe. We're sending them out into a full arrest environment where a fall is possible and in a lot of cases likely, and that's just an unacceptable way to be in most of those cases. So I think we should be elevating the user at one end and then elevating what we do to keep them safe at the other end. So I totally agree we need a lot more control over the hardware that we hook them to. We've got to build a better mousetrap if you like, but we've got to have some better mice as well.
So, I mean, that goes to 2 points that I think go to the heart of Ken's suggestion, which is a licensing accreditation sort of combination, so that you really have confidence in relation to the competence of the people doing the work and using.
So licensing for putting the equipment in, but a strong set of licensing for the users as well. And I'll give you an example, and that's the Australian Rope Access Association. It's got a 3-level licensing system. Rescue and proper supervision is built into the structure of the whole licensing system. That should exist in fall protection as well. It's a very cheap industry to get into, either as an installer or a user, and I don't think it should be that cheap. I think there has to be some costs, in which case the costs will then drive people to look at other options where they might put a stair or a ladder in instead of fall protection, for example, or might put a BMU in instead of some other lesser form of access.
Good luck convincing a politician of that, increasing costs. And
good luck, I know. But that's how it needs to be.
Regarding the new legislation, in a practical sense, from an installer's and a user's point of view, nothing much has really changed. There's a lot of semantics and the structure and what have you, but in a practical sense, nothing's changed. Now, of all those anchors that were surveyed, a lot of them, the installations that have been done in the last 3 to 6 months are not materially better or worse to the installations that were done 10, 12 years ago. So there isn't a pattern that relates to the legislation. At the moment, we've got a lot of top-end regulation and laws which impose this huge obligation and this huge legal liability on directors and workplaces and the PCBUs and the like. But we've got a totally deregulated framework for actually installing the stuff. At the end of the day, credit card, hacksaw, and screwdriver. How does the end user, how does the client really gauge whether someone's competent to do this or not? So the first thing I think that needs to happen is we need to step back from the deregulation, and there needs to be more intervention. We need to give it framework. So the first thing is, if Australian standards are an absolute bare-based minimum, then they should be compulsory, and they need to be adhered to. The second thing is we've got a nationally recognised framework for training. Bring in a training requirement that could be as simple as a 4-hour exercise on how to install guardrail. And once someone's been through that 4-hour exercise, it doesn't have to come at a big cost, then they're deemed competent to install guardrail. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to be perfect, but it's going to be a hell of a lot better than what we've got, that anyone can go and buy guardrail with a credit card on the back of the ute, off you go, and go and install it. So the second thing is the training. The third thing is the licensing, because if it's not mandatory to go and do this training, the same way you need a forklift license, no one's going to do it. So let's have a license for this high-risk activity that the work cover authorities, not just in New South Wales, because it's across the whole country that I'm seeing this, that there's a license for this sort of work. There's a license to make sure that the installers are working safely, that they're not going to hurt themselves, and there's a license to make sure that the gear they're putting in is properly designed and it's properly installed. And then finally, regarding the certification, the self-certification is not working. There's a complete conflict of interest asking the installer who went and bought the guardrail yesterday afternoon with his credit card to then provide a certificate of compliance. It's a complete conflict of interest. So at some level, and particularly with new buildings, I think that the BCA, the Building Code, and the ABCB needs to integrate these standards into their framework, and they need to turn around to the building certifier and say, okay, you need to take some responsibility for it. Now, the building certifiers, we asked them to be here today, a representative, but they didn't come. And their position is that with pink bats, height safety, everything else, they rely on certificates of the installers. But how do you determine if a pink bat installer has got any competency? So they just, and I've got sympathy with the building certifiers, because they can't go and do the certification on the certifier certificate. They need to know that the certificate's issued by a licensed installer, which gives them comfort. And then they can go and ask for these things. But at the moment, none of this stuff's in the BCA for rooftops. A building certifier walks straight past it. So I think we need, and in the short term, I think there needs to be a lot more regulation. And I know I'm giving myself a noose here, because as a business owner and an operator, I don't want red tape, I don't want regulation, I want to be able to compete. But I think in the first instance, you need some sort of control over the product. If you want to call it an anchor point, then it's got to comply with Australian standards. And either it does or it doesn't. And so products need to be certified and should be compulsory. We need to look at training, we need to look at licensing, and then we need to look at the certification. And then I think we've got a framework that we can all work with, and that will be safe. So it's not just about bureaucracy and regulation gone bad.